You ever feel like your brain is permanently stuck in loading mode because your boss thinks sleep is, I don't know, some kind of performance-sapping weakness,
Oh, totally. Or you see those posts online, the grind set humble brags.
right? And you're secretly just calculating how many therapy sessions you can afford with, like, your tiny overtime pay?
Uh, exactly.
Well, buckle up because we are diving headfirst into the wild world of work culture in China. It seems some companies there are suddenly acting like they've discovered this radical concept, rest.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. All the stuff you dug up points to this, well, eyebrow-raising trend. Certain big companies in China seemingly slamming the brakes on the crazy overtime.
We're talking about the land of 996, right?
Yeah.
That whole 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week thing. It's been like the unofficial anthem for, well, for ambition,
Hmm.
especially in tech and manufacturing. It's almost like a Thunderdome.
Absolutely, a total Thunderdome. And the sources you found, they don't exactly paint a rosy picture of what that actually does to people.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, forget just feeling a bit tired. We're talking, what, over 75% of workers in big cities reporting they're basically walking zombies.
Yeah.
Chronic fatigue, bodies achy.
Yeah, like they wrestled a bear, messed up sleep, weird eating habits, stress levels just totally through the roof.
You've got to wonder, right, at what point does the rise and grind actually just grind people down?
Exactly. And that's where these recent rumblings are catching everyone's eye. We're hearing whispers, seeing actual announcements, DJI, the drone guys,
Yeah.
apparently imposing a 9 p.m. curfew. Seriously.
A curfew. Wow.
Then you've got Midea, the appliance giant,
Right.
strict 6:20 p.m. shutdown, and a ban on after-hours digital torture, meetings.
Digital torture, I like that.
Even Hair, another big name, supposedly mandating actual 2-day weekends.
Get out. A whole 2 days.
I know, revolutionary stuff. And get this, there was even a court case. It backed overtime pay just for answering work messages when you're off the clock, on your personal time.
Okay, so it feels like maybe the first crack in that whole work till you drop thing.
Yeah, maybe. But the big question, the one keeping HR folks up at night, probably at slightly less unreasonable hours now, is this legit?
Right. Is it a real sea change? Or just, some carefully choreographed PR stunt?
And what's really driving it? Is it like a top-down order, or there were other, maybe sneakier forces at play?
That's what we're going to try and figure out today. Wade through the articles, the analysis, even peek at what the Europeans are up to.
Yeah, try to get to the bottom of what's really going on and why you, listening, should even care.
Because trust me, there are some twists here you probably won't see coming.
Definitely. The info you pull together, it includes these deep dives into the whole anti-overtime buzz within China, plus discussion around EU regulations and some pretty insightful speculation on the real motivations. It's like a puzzle.
Okay, let's jump in. This 996 thing. It's almost like a cultural export in some weird way.
Yeah.
How deep did this culture actually run?
Oh, for a long time, 996 was almost like a badge of honor, a symbol of China's insane economic growth, especially in tech and manufacturing.
Right, like you had to do it.
Pretty much. The belief was those crazy hours were the price of admission, to compete globally, to innovate, just to survive in that relentless environment. It was deeply ingrained, a rite of passage almost.
But the hangover from that
Mm-hmm.
must have been brutal.
Yeah.
Judging by our sources, anyway.
Yeah.
Not exactly sustainable for actual human beings.
Not even close. Like we said, the toll on well-being, immense. The sheer number of reports on burnout, stress-related health problems, the complete obliteration of work-life balance, it just hammers home how unsustainable it was.
You can only squeeze people so much, right?
Exactly. Productivity tanks eventually. And the societal fallout, family stressed, health declining, that becomes a drag on everything. That relentless focus on hours, it might fuel growth initially, but it creates a ceiling on innovation later.
Because everyone's running on fumes.
Pretty much. Where does fresh thinking come from then? It's a system that optimizes for sheer effort, not necessarily smart output. And that's key for long-term economic health.
Which brings us neatly to this apparent shift. These companies, DJI, Midea, Hair, suddenly acting like they've, read a pamphlet on employee wellness.
Well, it seems less spontaneous when you look at what our sources say is happening domestically. There's this rise of the anti-Niwan directive.
Niwan. Okay, I've heard that term. It's fascinating. What's the gist?
It basically describes this state of like hyper competition where everyone is just frantically putting in more and more effort, but the overall pie isn't getting any bigger. Think of everyone in a packed stadium standing on their tiptoes to see better.
Right, but nobody actually can see better. They're just all more uncomfortable.
Exactly. The joys of collective discomfort, right?
So how does that translate from the stadium to the office cubicle?
In the workplace, new one is that relentless rat race.
Hmm.
Longer hours, more workload, even when it doesn't actually lead to better results or breakthroughs. 996 is like the poster child for it.
Okay. And the government started noticing this.
Big time. Starting around late 2024, early 2025, they began to actively talk about and address this phenomenon.
So this wasn't just a few CEOs having a sudden crisis of conscience. There was actual government weight behind it.
Precisely. The Central Economic Work Conference in December 2024 specifically called for comprehensive management of involution-style competition.
That sounds serious.
It wasn't just a throwaway line, it actually made it into the 2025 government work report. That signals a real policy priority.
Okay.
Then you had the NDRC, that's the big planning agency, explicitly saying illegal overtime was a no-go, even encouraging flexible schedules, staggered holidays.
And the market regulators, too,
Yeah.
CNMR.
The State Administration for Market Regulation, kind of like the market police, they held meetings with businesses specifically on this. It was definitely a coordinated top-down signal.
Right. So the government sees Naiwan as a problem. But why? What's the angle for the people in charge?
Several key reasons. First, boosting domestic spending. The logic's pretty simple. Burnt-out workers don't exactly have the time or energy to go shopping, travel, or, spend money.
They just want to collapse on the couch.
Exactly. So give people back some time. The hope is they'll spend more, boost consumption, make the economy less reliant on just exports. Their Consumption Expansion Action Plan even mentions protecting the right to rest as a tactic.
Makes sense. An exhausted workforce isn't exactly a shopping spree waiting to happen. What else? More innovation, less. Sheer grind.
That's the other big part. There's this growing realization that just throwing more hours at a problem isn't the best way forward for long-term growth. Not sustainable.
Right.
The idea is to shift from that human wave tactic to something smarter, using tech better, streamlining processes, and this is key, tapping into employee creativity.
Yeah.
There's even a saying, smart work is also struggle.
Interesting. So compete on brains, not just endurance.
Pretty much. Compete on efficiency, not just who can pull the longest all-nighters.
And I guess the whole happy citizen, stable society thing can't hurt either, right? A population constantly on edge isn't great for harmony.
Absolutely. The widespread grumbling about 996 in Naiwan, especially among younger folks who are, let's say, less thrilled about sacrificing their entire lives for work.
Yeah, you hear about that. Gen Z values things differently.
Totally. So that grumbling became a real social pressure point. By pushing back on these long hours, the government is also trying to address public discontent, improve well-being, keep things stable.
Okay, so when companies like DJI and Medea suddenly announce these shiny new overtime policies right after the government starts talking anti-Naiwan, that timing seems maybe not entirely coincidental.
The timing is definitely notable, yeah. Medea's big announcement in early 2025, DJI's 9 p.m. curfew, they landed suspiciously close to the government push.
So it's like they're signaling, hey, we heard you.
Widely seen that way. We're on the same team, we get the message. In China's system, major companies often need to show they're aligned with Beijing. It's like saying, we're on board, good citizens, even if the reality behind the scenes is maybe a bit more complicated.
Right, a bit more nuanced. And it's interesting, you mentioned the initial focus seemed to be on specific sectors, cars, batteries, solar.
Yeah, that suggests it might be tied into broader industrial strategy too, maybe restructuring those sectors, cooling down price wars, pushing tech upgrades. So it's not just about worker well-being, it could be a tool for wider economic engineering.
Okay, so there's a clear push from inside China, but our sources also point across the pond to the EU, land of regulations.
Yes. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD for short. Quite a mouthful.
CSDDD sounds bureaucratic.
Yeah.
Lay it on us. What is it?
It's potentially a game changer. It basically aims to make respecting human rights and the environment a legal obligation for companies doing business in the EU.
So shifting from just writing nice reports to actually being legally responsible.
Exactly. It mandates actual, enforceable due diligence. Companies need systematic processes to find, prevent, and fix negative impacts, human rights, environment throughout their operations.
Their own operations.
And their subsidiaries. And get this, their entire chains of activity, suppliers, manufacturers, even some downstream partners.
Wow. Okay, so if you're like a clothing brand.
Right. It's not just the factory sewing the shirts. It's potentially the farm growing the cotton, the dye suppliers, the shippers, the whole chain.
So where do our overworked friends in the factories fit into this Euro plan?
Labor rights are central. CSDD draws on big international standards, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ILO core conventions. So companies have to tackle forced labor, child labor.
The really bad stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But also ensure fair working conditions. And here's the kicker for our chat. Reasonable working hours?
Uh-huh. There it is.
Now, it doesn't set a specific number like 40 hours, but the whole point is preventing worker exploitation, and excessive overtime is clearly part of that picture. It also covers fair wages, safety, the right to unionize.
So it's not just about saving the planet. It's about treating the people making the stuff like actual humans.
Precisely. And there are other parts, like climate transition plans for big companies. Plus, it has teeth. Monitoring, reporting, and actual enforcement.
Teeth. Like what?
EU member states will have regulators. Companies that don't comply could face hefty fines up to 5% of their global net turnover.
5% of global turnover. Ouch!
Yeah. Plus civil lawsuits, maybe getting barred from EU government contracts. That 5% figure, that'll make CEOs sweat.
Suddenly, those sustainability reports look a lot less optional.
Okay, so how does this Brussels brainwave actually hit companies in Beijing or Shanghai? They're not exactly in the EU.
Good question. It has direct and indirect reach.
Mm-hmm.
Directly, it hits Chinese companies with subsidiaries in the EU above certain size thresholds.
Okay.
It also bites non-EU companies, including Chinese ones, if they make a lot of money, hundreds of millions of euros selling stuff into the EU market. Even franchise or licensing models can get caught.
And this starts when? It's phased. The biggest players start feeling it in 2027, then more companies get included by 2029.
So the really big Chinese firms with major EU business are directly on the hook. What about the smaller ones? The suppliers feeding those big guys?
And that's where it gets really interesting, the indirect pressure. Even if a Chinese factory isn't directly covered by CSDDD, if it supplies a European company that is covered, it's going to feel the heat. That EU company is legally required to check its supply chain.
So they'll start asking questions, doing audits.
Exactly. Questionnaires, audits, putting CSDDD compliance clauses right into contracts. It's a ripple effect. Suddenly, that Chinese factory making widgets for a German retailer has a real incentive to clean up its act regarding working hours, safety, whatever.
Even if the Chinese government isn't specifically forcing them on that particular point.
Right. Because the risk is losing that EU customer, getting cut off from that massive lucrative market. That is a very powerful persuader.
Okay, so it sounds like these two forces, the domestic anti-on stuff and this EU CSDDD regulation, that could be pushing in kind of the same direction. Maybe for different reasons, but still.
There's definitely overlap in the goals, yeah. Both touch on issues like excessive work hours. But there could be friction, too.
How so?
Well, the CSDDD's detailed demands and big penalties might shine a spotlight on any gaps in China's domestic enforcement. And it could force companies to make changes that cost money, creating tension with profit goals, especially if local enforcement stays weaker for companies just selling domestically.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so it's not all just about corporate enlightenment and employees suddenly discovering hobbies. What other, maybe more self-serving motives might be behind these companies talking about less overtime?
You definitely hit it. It's a whole tangled web. The political signaling is huge. We talked about that.
Yeah.
Echoing the government line. That's politics 101 in some contexts. Demonstrating loyalty, showing you're aligned.
A corporate, yes, sir.
Basically. But there are also cold, hard economic reasons, like we discussed with Naiwan. Maybe companies are realizing just demanding more hours isn't efficient, diminishing returns.
Right. People get tired, make mistakes.
Exactly. So maybe they're looking to optimize, use automation, foster a workforce that's actually engaged and productive. And hey, fewer hours often means lower utility bills, less overhead.
I got to cut costs somewhere.
Why keep the lights on if everyone's gone home to actually, live a little?
Fair point. What about other international pressures? Beyond just the EU.
Oh, yeah. You've got the U.S. with its Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA, and the EU has another one coming, the Forced Labor Regulation, which is even broader.
More regulations.
These are putting serious pressure on companies to ensure their supply chains are totally clean of forced labor. And let's be honest, forced labor conditions often go hand in hand with excessive hours and awful working environments.
So if you want to sell globally,
especially into Europe and North America, yeah. Playing by these rules is becoming less of a suggestion and more like a basic requirement for market access, a survival tactic.
So it's not just about getting a pat on the back. It's about keeping your pass to the biggest markets.
Totally. And don't forget PR and talent. 996 has taken a beating reputationally. There have been tragic stories.
Definitely.
So announcing anti-overtime policies, it's a way to polish that image and appeal to younger workers, Gen Z, who really value work-life balance more. They aren't exactly lining up to live in the office.
So it's like this perfect storm of factors pushing them.
Seems like it. Ticking government boxes, maybe finding efficiencies, dealing with global rules, and trying to look good to attract talent. It's like corporate 4D chess.
Which brings us back again to the big one. Is this real change or just fancy talk? What do the actual numbers say about working hours in China right now?
Yes. This is where the feel-good story hits a speed bump, or maybe a wall.
Oh,
While you hear all this talk about cutting back, there's a lot of skepticism, and probably for good reason.
why is that?
Many people on the ground say no overtime often just means the work follows you home. You're still glued to your phone answering work messages late at night.
Right, those unofficial online meetings after dinner.
Exactly. Your home basically becomes this unpaid extension of the office, and the single-day weekend? Still very much a thing in many places, plus that deep cultural pressure, almost shame, about actually taking your vacation days.
So the grind just moves from the office lights to your living room lamp.
That seems to be a common experience, yeah. And the official stats, they paint a pretty sobering picture.
How sobering.
Well, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, their 2024 data put China's average weekly hours at 46.1. That's noticeably higher than a lot of other major economies.
Okay, 46.1.
But China's own National Bureau of Statistics, their numbers are even higher, averaged 49.0 hours in 2023. And get this, January 2025 hit 49.1 hours.
Wow, 49.1. That's a lot. Highest in nearly 2 decades, right?
Yep. And the kicker, that NBS data usually excludes lunch breaks.
Seriously. So the real number could be even higher.
Could be. And you hear reports of even longer hours in super competitive sectors
Yeah.
like the auto industry. So yeah, those numbers definitely throw some cold water on the everyone's working less now idea.
Okay, huge disconnect then. They have labor laws, right?
Yeah.
Laws about hours and overtime.
They do. China's laws set standards. 8-hour day, 40 or 44-hour week, limits on monthly overtime, rules for overtime pay. The problem is enforcement.
The classic enforcement gap.
Exactly. The agency's supposed to monitor this, often stretched thin, under-resourced. It's a massive economy to oversee. And historically, the penalties for breaking overtime rules, often just warnings, maybe small fines, not exactly terrifying for a big company.
So the cost of breaking the rules is just factored in, like the cost of doing business.
Pretty much seems that way sometimes. The legal framework is there, but it often lacks teeth in practice.
So what do the workers themselves think? Are they celebrating or just rolling their eyes?
It's really mixed. I mean, who wouldn't welcome the idea of shorter hours? But there's huge skepticism about whether policies will actually change things day to day.
Right. Will it stick?
Yeah. Some worry about losing income if overtime pay was a big chunk of their earnings. Others feel the pressure's still there regardless of policy. You even see things like the lying flat movement.
Sort of a quiet protest.
Kind of a form of resistance. And these extreme examples, like young people taking insane 24-hour international trips just to escape the grind for a moment, it shows how deep the desire for a break is.
Wow. So the core issue really boils down to this enforcement deficit.
Yeah.
Laws on paper, but not enough happening on the ground.
That seems to be a huge part of it. And underneath that, this deeper conflict. The government saying it wants less nuance, better well-being, but clashing with the economic pressures that push companies toward long hours to stay competitive, and individuals needing the hours to make ends meet.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground. The directives, the spin, the stats, the skepticism. What are the key takeaways here, the main nuggets?
Okay, nutshell version. It's complex, multiple drivers. There are real forces pushing for change, like policy and international regs. But there's still this big gap between the talk about no overtime and the actual long hours people are working.
And companies have mixed motives. It's not all altruism.
Definitely not. And real, effective enforcement of the existing laws, that's still the massive hurdle.
And if you had to pick the dominant force right now, what's really moving the needle? or trying to.
Well, initially, that government anti-Naiwan talk seemed key for the first wave of announcements, political signaling.
Right.
But increasingly, it feels like the CSDDD and those other international rules, with their approaching deadlines and real financial penalties, that's putting more tangible pressure on companies that sell overseas. The domestic economic goals give a reason why less overtime might be good, but a real internal culture shift prioritizing well-being seems less central so far.
So crystal ball time. What's the future look like? A work-life revolution in China, or just tweaking the system?
Probably more evolution than revolution, and likely uneven. We'll keep hearing the government rhetoric for sure, but real change depends on enforcement stepping up.
And the CSDDD effect.
That will deepen as deadlines get closer. We might see a split export companies having to adapt more seriously than purely domestic ones. That tension between policy goals and economic reality isn't going away soon.
And the younger generation.
Long term, their different values could be a major force for change. But that's a slower burn.
Okay, so practical advice. If you're a business connected to China sourcing, operating there, what's the smart move?
Due diligence. Seriously, deep due diligence. Don't just read the press releases.
Look under the hood.
Exactly. Start prepping for CSDDD now, even if you think that doesn't directly apply yet. Check actual conditions in your supply chain. Strengthen contracts. Understand enforcement is patchy. Stay informed. Things change fast.
And for the policy analysts, the watchers.
Keep eyes on enforcement data if you can get it. Track the CSDDD impact. Analyze that complex dance between labor policy and economic goals.
And for our listeners, just trying to understand the world.
Realize this working hour issue in China is at this complex crossroads. Politics, economics, global rules, local culture. There are signals pointing towards change, maybe driven by international pressure as much as anything else.
But deep habits and economic pressures mean it won't happen overnight.
Exactly. It'll likely be gradual, uneven. But it's worth thinking about what these shifts or lack thereof mean for global labor standards and for the stuff that ends up in our shopping carts.
So, while the headlines might hint at China chilling out on work hours, our deep dive shows it's way more complicated. A real push and pull. Top-down goals, bottom-line needs, global eyes watching, and a work culture that's deeply, deeply embedded.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating and maybe a bit exhausting just observing how it all plays out.
Definitely. Thanks for helping untangle this web with me.